Fire's warmth settled over the cabin, and the smell of burning pine mingled with the faint tang of stale whiskey. R leaned back in his chair, the metal of his prosthetic leg catching the flicker of the flames. He'd spent most of his life avoiding conversations like this one, but tonight, something in Lucas's insistence got to him. Maybe it was the look in the kid's eyes, equal parts curiosity and respect, or maybe he was just tired of carrying the story alone. R lit another cigarette, exhaling smoke that coiled lazily upward. He stared at the tattoo on his arm, the apocalyptic imagery etched into his skin. "You want the whole thing?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Lucas nodded. "All right," R said, crushing the cigarette into the ashtray. "But I'm telling you now, it ain't a hero's story. This is about survival, nothing else." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and began. The town didn't even have a name worth remembering. Just a couple of streets, a diner that never cleaned its coffee pots, and a gas station where the pump looked like it belonged in a museum. I wasn't planning on staying long. I'd stopped for a meal and a night's rest, but the whispers started before I even finished my coffee. The waitress was the first to let it slip. "Don't go out after dark," she said, her voice shaky. "And don't listen to the wind." Wind never scared me before, I told her, but she didn't laugh. By the time I'd paid the bill, 3 more people had warned me about the woods. Missing hikers, hunters disappearing, strange noises at night. I've heard it all before, but something about this place felt different. The way their eyes darted to the forest, like it was watching them back. I wasn't planning on getting involved, but as I was leaving town, I spotted the sheriff's bulletin board. A flyer pinned to the corner, almost hidden under layers of outdated notices. "Missing Emily Ward, age 9, last seen near the northern forest." I stared at the picture of the girl, her toothy smile frozen in black and white. She couldn't have been missing more than a few days. I tried to ignore it, walked out to my truck and got in, but I didn't leave. The forest was quiet in a way that wasn't natural. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the underbrush and the occasional creak of a tree shifting under its own weight. The deeper I went, the worse the smell got, like something had died and kept on rotting for years. I found the first remains about an hour in. It wasn't much, just a rib cage and some scattered bones. Animal, I thought at first, until I saw the shirt sleeve tangled in the roots of a nearby tree. It was small, too small to be an adult's. My stomach turned, but I kept going. I've seen worse. Hell, I've done worse. But the further I went, the more signs I found. Shredded backpacks, torn up tents, blood smears on the bark of trees. And then I found the clearing. At first, I thought it was just another sign of death, bones scattered in the dirt. But then I looked closer. They weren't scattered. They were arranged, circles within circles, like some kind of ritual. And in the middle, half buried in the dirt, was a doll. It didn't make sense. I'd heard the stories about Wendigos, but they weren't supposed to be this smart. They were hunters, not artists. Then the wind shifted, and I heard it, a low guttural growl that turned my blood to ice. I turned, shotgun in hand, and caught my first glimpse of it. Tall and skeletal, its skin stretched so thin over its bones that it looked like parchment. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and its claws were long enough to make me doubt the effectiveness of my gun. I've hunted a lot of things, but this was something else. It didn't charge right away. Just stood there, watching me, its breath coming out in short, sharp puffs that fogged the cold air. I could feel the intelligence behind those eyes, the kind of cruel calculation you don't see in normal predators. When it moved, it was faster than anything I'd ever seen. I fired, the buckshot hitting it square in the chest, but all it did was knock the thing back a step. It screamed, a sound that wasn't quite human, but wasn't entirely animal either, and lunged again. This time I was ready. I rolled to the side, letting it crash into the tree behind me, and fired again. The shot hit its leg, and it stumbled, snarling. For a moment, I thought I had the upper hand. Then I heard the second growl, and the third. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw them, 3 more Wendigos, emerging from the shadows like they'd been waiting for their turn. Shit, I muttered, reloading as fast as I could. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It was a fight for survival. The wind finally began to stir, pushing through the trees like a cold breath from something watching just beyond the veil of darkness. I crouched low, my back pressed against the jagged bark of a pine, every muscle in my body tense. The growls surrounded me, low and guttural, echoing through the forest as though the trees themselves were mocking my fear. I gripped the shotgun tighter, the cold metal biting into my fingers. The 3 Wendigos circled the clearing, their skeletal forms gliding between the trees with an eerie grace. Their glowing eyes never left me, pinning me in place like a predator watching wounded prey. I'd faced plenty of monsters before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt like it was playing with me. I needed time. Time to think. Time to reload. Time to not die. But time was the one thing I didn't have. The first Wendigo struck without warning, leaping from the shadows with a screech that tore through the silence. I rolled to the side, barely avoiding the swipe of its claws, and fired a blind shot. The blast caught its shoulder, splintering bone and sending it crashing into a nearby tree. It didn't scream, didn't writhe, it just snarled and pushed itself back to its feet, like pain was a foreign concept. Figures, I muttered, rising to a crouch and swinging the shotgun toward the next movement in the dark. The second one was faster, darting around me like it was testing my reflexes. I turned to follow it, my pulse hammering in my ears. But it was a trick. The third one lunged from the opposite direction, slamming into me with the force of a freight train. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs, the shotgun skittering out of reach. Its claws tore into my jacket, slicing through fabric and grazing skin. I grabbed the nearest rock, a jagged fist-sized chunk of granite, and slammed it into the side of the Wendigo's head. It screeched, its ember-like eyes flaring as it staggered back, giving me just enough time to scramble for the shotgun. The moment my fingers wrapped around the stock, I rolled onto my back and fired. The blast caught it in the chest, sending it sprawling into the dirt. I didn't wait to see if it got up. I was already moving, grabbing a handful of shells from my pocket and reloading as I stumbled toward the nearest tree for cover. The woods felt endless. Every direction looked the same: twisted branches, thick underbrush, and shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I knew I couldn't stay in one place, not with those things hunting me. I needed a plan, but every thought that came to mind ended with me dead, or worse. I pressed a hand to my side, wincing at the wet warmth spreading through the fabric. One of the Wendigos had gotten a decent swipe in, and the gash was deep enough to make me worry. The pain was sharp, but it kept me grounded, kept me moving. If I stopped, I was dead. The growls hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, more deliberate, like the creatures were enjoying the chase. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, watching, waiting, ready to strike the moment I slipped up. They were hurting me, I realized, pushing me deeper into the forest. Toward what? I didn't want to know. I stumbled into another clearing. This one smaller, but just as grim. A pile of human remains lay in the center, bones picked clean and arranged in grotesque patterns. Symbols I didn't recognize had been etched into the dirt around the pile. Crude and chaotic, but deliberate. Whatever these things were, they weren't just mindless beasts. The sound of snapping branches pulled me out of my thoughts. I spun around, shotgun raised, but there was nothing there. Just the wind pushing through the trees and the faint, almost mocking growls that seemed to come from every direction. I backed away slowly, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and bumped into something solid, something warm. I turned, hard in my throat, and came face to face with the first Wendigo. It towered over me, its emaciated form somehow radiating power, its glowing eyes burning with malice. For a split second, I froze. Then instinct kicked in, and I pulled the trigger. The blast took it point blank in the chest, sending it sprawling backward into the bone pile. It shrieked, a sound that made my ears ring, and scrambled to its feet, more furious than hurt. I fired again, aiming for its head this time, and the thing dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. The victory was short-lived. The other two Wendigos emerged from the shadows, their growls turning into full-throated roars. I could feel the ground vibrate beneath their steps as they closed in, their movements fluid and inhuman. This was it. I was out of shells, out of time, and out of options. My fingers found the lighter in my pocket almost on instinct. It was a cheap thing, more reliable for lighting cigarettes than saving lives, but it was all I had. I flicked it open, the tiny flame dancing in the cold night air, and held it toward the underbrush. The Wendigos hesitated, their growls turning into low rumbles. I didn't know if they feared fire, but it was worth a shot. "Come on, then," I muttered, holding the flame steady. "Let's see how fast you burn, you fuckers." The flame danced in my trembling hand, its faint warmth a fragile shield against the cold. The Wendigos stopped their advance, their glowing eyes fixed on the flickering light as if gauging its threat. Their growls turned guttural, almost like language, and for the first time I wondered just how much these things understood. I didn't have time to ponder. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and I could feel the blood trickling from the gash in my side, soaking through my shirt. Every second counted. I flicked the lighter shut and shoved it back in my pocket, turning and bolting into the trees. The forest blurred around me as I ran, every step sending jolts of pain through my body. My boots slipped on frost-covered roots, and branches clawed at my face and arms like skeletal hands, trying to pull me back. Behind me, the growls rose in unison, and the sound of snapping twigs told me they were closing in. I didn't dare look back. A rusted signpost loomed ahead, barely visible in the moonlight. The paint had long since faded, but the shape of an arrow pointed down a narrow trail. I veered toward it, praying it led somewhere, anywhere that wasn't more forest. The trail opened into a small clearing, and there it was, an old ranger station, half collapsed, but still standing. The roof sagged, and the windows were shattered, but it was shelter, a chance to regroup. I stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind me and jamming a broken chair under the handle for good measure. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. A single kerosene lamp sat on a dusty desk, its glass cracked but intact. "Please, work," I muttered, fumbling through the drawers until I found a box of matches. My hand shook as I struck one, the tiny flame illuminating the room just enough to see the fuel tank, still half full. I lit the lamp, the warm glow pushing back the shadows, and started searching the room. The shelves were mostly empty, but I found an old flare gun tucked behind a stack of moldy papers. 2 flares. Not much, but better than nothing. The growls outside grew louder, closer. I could hear them circling the building, their claws scratching against the walls. They were testing me, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Come on," I whispered, gripping the flare gun tightly. "Let's get this over with." The first one came through the window. Glass shattered as it leapt inside, its skeletal frame twisting in midair. I fired the flare gun without thinking, the bright red burst hitting it square in the chest. The creature howled, flames licking up its body as it thrashed against the floor. But it didn't die. Not right away. The fire spread slowly, eating away at its flesh. But the Wendigo kept moving, its claws gouging deep marks into the wooden floorboards. I grabbed the kerosene lamp and hurled it at the creature, the glass shattering on impact and dousing it in flames. This time, it went still. No time to celebrate. The second one slammed into the door, splintering the frame and sending the makeshift barricade flying. I ducked behind the desk as it charged, its claws raking across the surface, inches from my head. I pulled the lighter from my pocket and flicked it open, igniting a stack of papers and shoving them toward the Wendigo's face. It reared back, hissing, giving me just enough time to grab a length of broken wood and shove it into the flames. The makeshift torch flared to life, and I swung it at the creature, the fire catching its arm. It screeched, retreating toward the door, but I didn't let up. I drove the torch into its chest, forcing it outside, and slammed the door shut again. The third one was smarter. It didn't charge blindly like the others. Instead, it stayed outside, circling, its growls rising and falling like a twisted song. I could hear the crunch of its footsteps on the frost, slow and deliberate. It was waiting. I collapsed against the wall, the torch still burning faintly in my hand. My side throbbed and my vision blurred, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. My eyes landed on the kerosene canister in the corner, and an idea began to form. It was reckless, desperate, but I didn't have much else. I grabbed the canister, dousing the doorway and the floor around it, then piled what little furniture I could find in front of the door. The flare gun was still tucked into my belt, the last flare loaded and ready. The growls stopped. For a moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then the door exploded inward, and the final Wendigo charged. I fired the flare, hitting the kerosene-soaked barricade. The room erupted into flames, the heat slamming into me like a wave. The Wendigo screamed, thrashing wildly as the fire consumed it, its claws gouging deep into the walls as it tried to escape. I stumbled backward, the heat scorching my skin, and tripped over a fallen beam. The Wendigo's screams faded, replaced by the crackling of flames as the fire spread. I didn't wait to see if it was truly dead. I crawled through the shattered window, the cold night air hitting me like a slap, and collapsed in the snow. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the stars as the forest burned behind me. My side bled freely, the gash deeper than I'd realized. I knew I couldn't stay there. but I also knew I wouldn't make it far in my condition. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't enough to drown out the thought echoing in my mind. They weren't just hunting, they were learning. The Wendigo was on me before I could react, its claws slamming into my chest and knocking me flat on my back. My shotgun was gone, lost somewhere in the snow, and the pain in my ribs made every breath feel like knives were slicing through me. I swung wildly with the burning crutch I had fashioned, the fire licking at the creature's face. But it wasn't enough. It backed off, just for a moment, and I scrambled to my feet, staggering toward the nearest tree for support. That's when the second one came. It blindsided me from the left, its skeletal claws raking through my side and throwing me into the tree trunk. My head snapped back against the bark, and for a moment, everything went white. I barely had time to register the third Wendigo rushing in, its glowing eyes locked onto me like a predator, with its prey in sight. I moved without thinking. The lighter was still in my pocket, and I flicked it open, lighting the fabric-wrapped crutch and swinging it like a club. The flames flared in the darkness, casting grotesque shadows of the creatures that surrounded me. The first one hissed and backed away, but the second wasn't as cautious. It lunged, claws extended, and I caught it mid-air with the burning crutch. The wood splintered on impact, and the fire engulfed its bony chest, the stench of burning flesh filling the air. But I wasn't fast enough for the third. It came from behind, its claws ripping into my left leg just above the knee. I screamed, twisting around, and swung the broken remnants of the crutch at its face. The impact knocked it back, but not before it sank its teeth into my thigh and ripped. The pain was indescribable. I collapsed to the ground, my leg a shredded mess, the snow beneath me turning dark with blood. The Wendigo backed off momentarily, snarling as it swallowed a chunk of flesh, its glowing eyes fixed on me like it was savoring the kill. I pressed a hand to my leg, desperate to staunch the bleeding, but it was no use. The wound was too deep, the damage too severe. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. Then I remembered the kerosene canister. It was still in the ranger station, barely 20 feet away. I forced myself to move, dragging my broken body across the snow, the cold biting into my skin like 1,000 needles. The Wendigos followed, their guttural growls growing louder as they closed in. I reached the station just as the first one lunged. I grabbed the kerosene canister and swung it with every ounce of strength I had left, the metal catching the creature across the skull and sending it sprawling. The second one was right behind it, but I managed to splash the kerosene in its direction, dousing it in the flammable liquid. With trembling hands, I pulled the lighter from my pocket and flicked it open. The flame caught instantly, and the Wendigo shrieked as it went up in flames, thrashing wildly as the fire consumed it. The third one hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it watched its companion burn. I didn't give it a chance to attack. I dragged myself toward the remnants of the crutch, now little more than a burning stick, and jammed it into the pool of kerosene at my feet. The flames roared to life, creating a wall of fire between me and the creature. The immediate danger was gone, but I knew I was out of time. The blood loss was too much, and my leg was ruined. If I didn't act now, I'd bleed out long before I ever saw daylight again. I glanced at the burning crutch, its embers glowing red-hot, and swallowed hard. "Damn it," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. "This is gonna hurt." I grabbed the crutch, the heat scorching my palms, and pressed it against the wound. The smell of burning flesh hit me first, sharp and acrid, followed by a pain so intense it felt like my entire body was on fire. I screamed, my voice raw and ragged, but I didn't stop. When I finally let go, the bleeding had stopped. The wound was cauterized, the blackened flesh sealing the jagged edges where my leg had been. I collapsed back into the snow, my body shaking, my vision dimming at the edges. The forest was silent now, save for the crackling of flames and the faint rustle of the wind. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I'd won. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, rising from the shadows beyond the firelight. There was still one left, and it wasn't finished with me yet. The growl cut through the silence like a blade, low and menacing, carrying the weight of a predator that knew it had won. I lay there, broken and bleeding, my body trembling from blood loss and exhaustion. My leg was gone, the crude cauterization stopping the bleeding, but leaving me teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. But I wasn't dead yet. The Wendigo emerged from the darkness, its skeletal form limping slightly, its smoldering flesh a grim reminder of the fire that had taken its kin. Its glowing eyes locked on mine, and it bared its jagged teeth in a snarl that sounded almost like a laugh. I forced myself to move, dragging my body across the snow toward the ranger station's ruins. Every inch felt like a mile, the cold seeping into my bones. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything. The Wendigo followed slowly, savoring the hunt. It knew I couldn't escape, and it was taking its time, letting the fear settle in. My hand closed around the flare gun, its weight unfamiliar and awkward in my bloodied grip. The last flare was still loaded, the single shot all that stood between me and whatever hell awaited on the other side of death. The Wendigo lunged. I twisted onto my back, raising the flare gun with what little strength I had left, and fired. The flare shot through the air, a brilliant red streak against the darkness, and struck the creature square in the chest. It screamed, a sound that shook the trees and rattled my teeth as the fire erupted across its body. But it didn't stop. Even as the flames consumed it, the Wendigo kept coming, its claws swiping wildly. One struck my shoulder, tearing through flesh and sending me sprawling into the snow. The world tilted, and for a moment, all I could see was the night sky, the stars spinning above me like a vortex. I reached for the kerosene canister, my fingers slick with blood, and tipped it over, pouring the last of the liquid into the snow. The Wendigo staggered closer, its smoldering body casting grotesque shadows across the clearing. With the last flicker of strength, I grabbed the burning remnants of the crutch and drove it into the pool of kerosene. The explosion wasn't big, but it was enough. The fire roared to life, engulfing the Wendigo in a column of flames. It screamed, thrashing wildly, but this time it didn't get back up. The fire consumed it completely, reducing it to ash as I lay there, the heat washing over me like a final cruel embrace. The forest was silent again. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the sky, waiting for the pain to finally take me. My body was numb, my mind drifting in and out of darkness, but I didn't die. By some miracle, or maybe just pure stubbornness, I dragged myself out of that forest. It took me 3 days. 3 days of crawling through the snow, fighting off the cold and the hunger, the sound of those Wendigo screams still echoing in my ears. When I finally reached the edge of town, I was half dead and barely conscious. A truck driver found me, loaded me into the back of his rig, and took me to the nearest hospital. They saved my life, patched me up as best they could. But the leg, there was no saving that. I've faced plenty of monsters since then. Bigger, meaner, smarter, but nothing ever came close to that night in the woods. Those things weren't just hunting, they were evolving. And if they're still out there, God help whoever crosses their path next. The fire in the cabin crackled softly as R leaned back in his chair, his prosthetic leg catching the light. He picked up his cigarette from the ashtray, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "That's the whole story," he said, his voice low and even. Lucas sat in silence, the weight of the tale hanging heavy in the room. The admiration he felt for R had deepened, but so had something else, an understanding of the cost of survival. "You're a stubborn bastard," Lucas finally said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. R chuckled, the sound dry and hollow. "Yeah, guess I am." The fire popped, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You think they're still out there?" Lucas asked, his voice quiet. R didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his eyes distant, as if the memory of that night had pulled him back to the edge of that clearing. "I hope not," he said finally. "But if they are, we'll be ready."